The emergency operations camp buzzed with the kind of organized energy only disaster drills could create. Rows of aircraft gleamed under floodlights, their sponsors' logos freshly polished for the cameras. Technicians moved in rhythm, voices clipped, checklists precise, while reporters captured every angle for the evening news. At the center stood Commander Whitmore, exuding confidence in his spotless uniform. He pointed at large digital screens showing wind velocities and satellite storm paths, briefing his team like a general about to lead a parade. Behind him, pilots in matching gear nodded in sync, their perfect posture as rigid as their flight plans. In the corner of the frame, nearly out of sight, stood a woman in worn boots and a faded green jacket. Hannah Lopez clutched a weathered clipboard with a hand-drawn map, its pencil marks smudged but clear. Her dark hair was tied back, her expression unreadable as she waited silently for someone to notice. She stepped forward, pointing to the coastal bend on her map, her voice calm but firm. "The river's shifted. The satellite image you're using is outdated. You'll need to adjust your drop path." Her suggestion barely landed before one of the junior officers waved her off with a practiced smile. "The systems are accurate. Let's stick to protocol." One of the younger pilots glanced at her clipboard and smirked. "Did you sketch that at the visitor center?" A few others chuckled politely, already turning away. Hannah didn't respond. She simply folded her map and stepped back. Her presence slowly erased from the group's choreography. The camera crews focused on the shiny twin-engine aircraft, the ones with built-in camera feeds and press liaisons in tailored vests. They captured the bright LED screens, the digital overlays, the commander's confident statements about data-driven accuracy. No one recorded the moment Hannah tried to speak. No one asked why she was standing there alone. She walked toward the edge of the airfield, away from the spotlight, her clipboard still in hand. The wind tugged at her jacket as she passed rows of equipment that looked impressive but felt detached. In her eyes was a quiet certainty, the kind built not from training manuals, but from storms survived. Behind her, Commander Whitmore declared the first wave would launch at dawn. He never mentioned the woman who warned them about the river. But as the camera panned out to catch the scale of the operation, some viewers might have noticed her small figure walking toward an old seaplane in the distance. She looked out of place, maybe even irrelevant. But something in her stride said she knew exactly where she was going. And for those watching closely, it was hard not to wonder. Why was she the only one carrying a map drawn by hand? And why did no one seem to care? Hannah Lopez wasn't the kind of person who turned heads at first glance. At 38, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was. Her clothes were practical, her boots scuffed, and her canvas jacket faded from sun and use. But her eyes were sharp, alert, always reading something others missed. She grew up near the edge of the Gulf in a house that smelled of salt and motor oil, where the hum of aircraft engines was more familiar than a lullaby. Her father, Rafael Lopez, had been a legend in his own quiet way. He flew rescue missions into flooded towns and broken landscapes long before satellite guidance and corporate funding became standard. As a child, Hannah rode beside him in their old seaplane, strapped into a second-hand seat, watching his hands move across the controls like a musician. He taught her to listen to the wind, to read the clouds, to smell a storm coming before the radar even blinked. He told her that flying wasn't about machines. It was about people. When he passed, the plane became hers. Not through inheritance papers or ceremony, but through hours spent under its wings, repairing what broke, learning its every sound. She worked as a part-time mechanic to make ends meet, doing odd jobs while saving for fuel and parts. No corporate patch ever touched her flight suit. In a world that worshipped new and shiny, Hannah stuck with the old and reliable. Her plane, a battered but loyal beast named Bluebird, had no built-in navigation system, no autopilot, and no media team to capture her takeoffs. But it had history, it had soul, and under her hands, it flew like it still remembered why it was built. Most people saw her as someone who didn't quite belong. She wasn't on payroll. She didn't wear the right uniform. She asked too many questions and offered too few credentials. But those who spent time with her noticed things. She never forgot a weather pattern. She could tell the weight of a load just by how a wheel sat on concrete. And when someone was too sick to speak or too scared to move, she knew exactly how to talk them through it. Her calm wasn't rehearsed. It was earned. There were no plaques on her walls, no framed degrees, just a photo of her and her father beside the Bluebird, grinning under a stormy sky, and a shelf lined with radios, maps, and journals worn soft from use. Every mark on those pages came from a flight she'd made, not a theory she'd studied. Her life was built around usefulness. She didn't care for speeches or spotlights. What mattered was getting people home, safe, and alive. And in that way, she was her father's daughter through and through. To strangers, she might have looked like a backup technician or someone who wandered in from the wrong entrance. But the people who knew her really knew her, understood that when everything else failed, Hannah was the one you wanted in the sky. Not because she had the fanciest plane, but because she always showed up when it counted. The emergency command camp looked like something out of a recruitment ad. Rows of sleek aircraft lined the tarmac, every inch polished and branded. Inside the main tent, massive screens glowed with satellite data, wind velocity models, and flight path projections pulled from the latest simulation software. Uniformed officers moved from station to station, nodding confidently at charts and forecasts. A logistics specialist adjusted her earpiece while a press liaison rehearsed the media timeline. There was a camera crew by the digital map, ready to stream the operation's launch to the agency's donors and sponsors. Every decision had been processed through a chain of approval. Routes were planned based on models, not on-the-ground updates. The commander's voice carried over the buzz full of practiced authority, announcing launch times and backup procedures with the finality of a man certain his plan couldn't fail. Hannah stood near the edge of the room unnoticed at first. She waited for a break in the noise, then stepped forward and unfolded her map. The river's shifted course, she explained. Last month's rain pushed the bend south. If the aircraft follow the current drop points, they'll overshoot, or worse, crash into the tree line. She tapped the pencil mark she'd drawn by hand, the same one she'd verified by flying over that ridge 3 weeks ago. A junior officer glanced at her paper, raised a brow, and gave her a tight smile. "We're using live satellite updates," he said. "The software already accounts for erosion patterns." The commander didn't even look her way. He nodded to the comms team and told them to begin countdown. One of the pilots made a joke under his breath about drawing with crayons, and someone else chuckled. The mission, it seemed, had no room for hand-drawn anything. To them, Hannah was just a civilian with a hobby, standing in the way of a perfectly calibrated rollout. Never mind that she had flown these routes more times than any of them. Never mind that the software couldn't see what a trained eye could read from a tree's lean or a cloud's movement. She stood there for another few seconds waiting. No one asked a question. No one took the map. Finally, she folded it back up, not with frustration, but with the kind of resignation that only comes from experience. They'd made up their minds. She wasn't part of the plan. Outside, the morning heat clung to the concrete. Cameras focused on the pilots boarding their high-tech aircraft. Behind the tents, her old seaplane sat alone. No drone followed its shadow. No technician scanned its systems. But as Hannah walked back toward it, her posture was steady. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Sometimes silence is the clearest way to tell someone they're making a mistake. They never officially said she couldn't fly. They just didn't include her name on the mission roster. When Hannah asked about it, one of the aides glanced at his clipboard and shrugged, said she was listed as ground support and there was no manifest slot available. That was all it took. No argument, no explanation. Just a paper with no line for her name and a polite dismissal wrapped in procedure. She walked away from the tent with slow, deliberate steps. The sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the tarmac. In the far corner of the airfield, her plane waited in silence, looking like something pulled from a different era. Bluebird wasn't part of the official lineup. Its paint was faded, some rivets visibly replaced, and the interior smelled faintly of old leather and oil. But Hannah had kept it airworthy with her own hands, often working through the night, earning just enough through mechanical jobs to keep it fueled. She opened the hangar and began loading the cargo she'd prepped weeks ago. Crates of water purification tablets, antibiotics, vacuum-sealed rations, and solar radios she'd paid for out of her own pocket. There were no logos, no branded packaging, just function over form. Each strap she tightened, each buckle she checked was done with the care of someone who had seen too many rushed mistakes. She wasn't rushing. She was preparing. There was no one to help. No ground crew, no flight officer giving clearance. But she didn't need them. What she needed was the same thing her father once told her back when she was a kid staring out the cockpit window at a flooded village. You don't fly for the paycheck. You don't fly for the praise. You fly because someone out there needs you and no one else is coming. That lesson never left her. It lived in her hands, in the quiet way she moved around the aircraft, in the way she paused before closing the cargo door, just listening to the wind shift outside. In the command tent, they were still adjusting timelines and reviewing forecasts. They hadn't noticed she was gone. No one was watching her pull on her headset or adjust the seat harness she'd reinforced with spare webbing. She looked down at the map one more time. Not the digital one. The hand-drawn chart with markings only she understood, born from years of flying this exact terrain and weather no simulation could predict. As the engine came to life with a low hum, steady and familiar, Hannah knew something they didn't. This storm would beat them. Their numbers, their tech, their structure. It would all fold under pressure. But someone had to go anyway. So she would, alone, uninvited, and entirely ready. By mid-morning, the airfield was buzzing with tension. Wind gusts had jumped to levels no one had predicted, and the sky had turned a shade of gray that made even seasoned pilots uneasy. One by one, aircraft that had taken off with confidence were radioing back in distress. Falcon 2 reported sudden downdrafts near the ridge and aborted landing. Delta Wing couldn't stabilize near Sector 5 and turned back low on fuel. The sleek jets that had looked unstoppable on the runway were now retreating, their sensors confused and their crews rattled. Inside the command tent, voices rose with each new emergency transmission. Maps were redrawn, call signs marked red, and coordinators started whispering behind clipboards. Commander Whitmore clenched his jaw as another aircraft declared a return to base order. He barked for updates, but all he heard was static and disappointment. Meanwhile, at the far end of the airfield, Hannah climbed into the Bluebird without saying a word. No one noticed her unlock the hatch, check the gauges, or reach for the manual throttle. The rain hadn't started yet, but the wind had teeth, and she felt it press against the side of the plane like a warning. She listened for the rhythm in the engine the way her father taught her. Not just the sound, but the feel of it, the subtle vibration through the seat. When it settled into the low, solid hum, she trusted she knew the time had come. There was no radio call, no request for clearance, no announcement to the press or command tent. She simply turned toward the auxiliary runway, the one no one else used, lined with faded markers and weeds creeping along the edges. The first push of throttle jolted the plane forward. It responded like a horse finally let out of the gate. The wind howled around the fuselage, but Hannah stayed steady, reading the shifts not through numbers but through instinct. At the main tent, an officer glanced up from the storm monitor. He caught the tail end of a small seaplane lifting off in the distance, its wings wobbling for a moment before leveling out. He hesitated, then looked away. It wasn't on the flight manifest. Probably just a test run. But Hannah wasn't testing anything. She was heading straight toward the storm, her fingers tight on the controls, her eyes scanning the clouds. Every drop of rain that hit the windshield reminded her that this was not a simulation. This was real weather, real terrain, and real people waiting for help. She didn't flinch when the turbulence kicked in. She adjusted altitude without needing confirmation from a tower. She knew these patterns had flown through worse with less. Back on the ground, radios kept crackling with withdrawal updates. Crew chiefs scrambled, ground staff ran reports, and no one realized that someone had just done what they were all trained not to do. While their perfect plans unraveled, she was already in the sky. No cameras caught her liftoff. No one gave her a countdown. But this was the moment everything changed. Not with a roar, not with a speech, just with the quiet certainty of a woman who knew when it was time to go. The first drop was near a community center that barely stood above the rising water. The roof had been reinforced with scrap wood and a blue tarp, the kind her father once taught locals to use as a signal. Hannah recognized it, instantly circled once, and adjusted her course without needing to speak a word over the radio. She came in low, tracing the shape of the current with her eyes, not a GPS line. Wind pushed hard against the wings, but the Bluebird held steady. The supply crate landed on target, cushioned by old tires someone had dragged into place as if they were waiting for her. Through the cockpit window, she saw hands waving from the windows. 3 adults, 2 children. One of the kids held up a hand-drawn sign that said, "Help," in shaky block letters. Hannah dipped the wing slightly in response, then pulled up, scanning for her next destination. The second drop was tougher. A string of houses connected by makeshift bridges, roofs covered in tarps, some families signaling with strips of orange fabric. That meant injuries. That meant she couldn't just drop and go. She landed on a stretch of water between 2 downed trees barely wide enough for her pontoons. The surface was filled with floating debris and she had to tilt slightly to avoid a submerged car, but she made it. An elderly man met her at the edge of a collapsed porch, waist-deep in floodwater, holding up a teenage boy wrapped in bandages. The kid was pale, his legs swollen and clearly infected. Hannah helped load him onto the Bluebird without a word. The man looked at her with disbelief and asked if she was with the official team. She shook her head and gave the only answer that mattered. "I'm the pilot who came." She didn't stay for thanks. There wasn't time. She lifted off again, the boy strapped in behind her, heading toward the nearest hospital, still accepting evacuees. Back in the command tent, the screen still showed red markers. One by one, the aircraft had failed. But somewhere in the chaos, a technician spotted a blip moving against the storm, steady and unshaken. They didn't know who it was yet. But she did. Her third stop was a church steeple surrounded by water with a dozen people huddled on the roof. She dropped blankets and food, then circled back to toss down a radio, hoping they could call for more help later. A woman on the roof dropped to her knees and clasped her hands in prayer as the Bluebird passed. Every flight carried more risk. The storm was thickening, the winds unpredictable. But Hannah knew the terrain better than any system. She recognized tree lines, current changes, and roof angles. She used shadows and scent and memory. Each person she saved was one more the system had missed. And with every pass, her resolve deepened. This wasn't about protocol. It never had been. It was about who showed up when it counted. And today, that was her. By noon, the command tent was falling apart. The wall of screens that once displayed clean, color-coded plans now showed blank sectors and aircraft icons blinking red. Out of 10 flights, 7 had returned early, and 3 were stuck in holding patterns with no safe place to land. Commander Whitmore stood at the center, jaw clenched, arms crossed. He barked questions faster than his team could answer. Where are the supplies? Why hasn't Echo 5 reported, and who approved the storm model? Every screen was a reminder of how much they hadn't planned for. A meteorologist muttered that the wind shear had shifted 5 degrees, throwing off the drop paths. A logistics officer stammered through updates, trying to spin the setbacks as manageable delays. But no one was buying it anymore. In a far corner of the room, a young technician raised a hand. He had picked up something strange. One aircraft was still moving, still transmitting from inside the storm, but it wasn't on the roster. It had no corporate tag. It was broadcasting under a civilian registration. The commander snapped to attention. "Identify it." The tech squinted at the data, then looked up, almost unsure of what he was seeing. Tail number 9C133. Owner, Hannah Lopez. There was a moment of stunned silence. Someone dropped a stylus. The flight officer next to him repeated the name like it couldn't be real. That plane shouldn't even be flying. She wasn't authorized. Another voice, calmer, cut through the noise. "That woman is in the flood zone. She's making drops. She's saving people." The room turned as if gravity had shifted. A screen flickered and showed grainy phone footage uploaded just minutes ago. A civilian had recorded a single-engine seaplane landing between flooded homes. Supplies dropped from the cargo door. A child waved from a roof. The video was already trending. One of the media reps ran out of the tent, phone pressed to her ear, shouting about coverage windows and press control. A liaison from a donor group stared at the footage wide-eyed. This wasn't part of the narrative. It wasn't what they had promised sponsors. Commander Whitmore stepped back from the main table. His voice dropped low and tight. "How did she get in the air?" The flight coordinator shook his head. She didn't ask. She just left. No one could explain it. They had focused so much on systems and clearances and branded equipment that they'd forgotten what an experienced pilot could do without all that. Whitmore glanced around the room, and for the first time all morning no one met his eyes. Captain Andrews, still red-faced from his aborted flight, cursed under his breath. He looked like someone who just realized the storm wasn't the only thing that had broken his plan. He muttered something about liability, but it didn't carry. Then, Rodriguez, quiet, until now, finally spoke. She stood with her arms crossed, voice steady. "While you followed Protocol 17, people were saved by a woman you ignored." No one argued. No one could. Because out there in the sky, a plane they dismissed was doing the work they couldn't, and everyone in that tent knew it. The press room was packed with noise and heat. Reporters shouted questions, cameras rolled, and the lights above the podium cast sharp shadows on Commander Whitmore's tired face. He stood stiffly, flanked by advisors reading from a prepared statement that no one truly believed. He spoke about unexpected weather conditions, about operational delays, about the importance of safety and procedure. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They wanted to talk about the woman who saved people while his team grounded their aircraft. The door opened halfway through his speech and all the cameras turned. Hannah walked in flight suit, still damp boots, muddy eyes clear. She didn't walk to the stage. She stood beside it where people could see her, but not control her. A reporter called out asking if she had permission to fly. She shook her head. I didn't wait for permission. People were drowning. Another voice asked how she planned missions without tech support. Her answer was calm. I flew with a map I made myself, based on what I saw, based on reality. The questions kept coming. Why did you go when no one else did? Because they were too busy managing the operation. I was trying to solve the problem. Whitmore turned to her, tried to take back control, but she didn't stop. Your team built a system that looks good on paper, but it crumbles in bad weather. You forgot what flying is for. The room fell into silence. You talk about safety protocols. You mean the ones that kept pilots in their chairs while people waved from rooftops. Someone asked if she had any regrets, only that I didn't take off sooner. Whitmore lowered his eyes. His shoulders sagged just enough to show the truth had landed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Another reporter asked what she would have done differently if she had led the mission. I would have listened. To the terrain. To the people who know it. I would have trained pilots to think, not just follow checklists. Her words hit like punches, not from anger, but from precision. You measured success by how professional your footage looked. I measured it by who was still breathing when I left. No one clapped. No one needed to. It wasn't a speech. It was a reckoning. She looked out at the crowd, at the leaders who dismissed her, and gave them the only lesson they couldn't ignore. Don't plan for the storm you wish you had. Fly the one you've got. Then she walked out, leaving them with their silence and their shame. In the weeks that followed, the storm change moved faster than anyone expected. The footage of Hannah's flights had gone viral, sparking debate, then demand. What started as public admiration became political pressure, and soon the agency had no choice but to respond. The board called her in not for punishment, but for help. They offered her a seat not in a cockpit, but at the table where decisions were made. For the first time, the system asked a pilot how it should work. Several commanders were reassigned quietly. No ceremony, no fanfare, just a shift in roles that made room for new leadership and a different kind of thinking. Hannah didn't ask for power. She asked for standards. She built a new training program, one where judgment mattered more than credentials, where flight time counted more than image. Every trainee was taught to read the sky, not just the screen. The new center opened at the edge of a decommissioned airfield. It had no marble lobby, no glass tower, just open hangars and quiet classrooms. The first batch of recruits came from places no one had recruited from before. Small towns, volunteer crews, retired military. Even a few civilian pilots who'd flown through fires and floods for nothing but gas money. Hannah interviewed each one herself. She didn't care how well they spoke. She cared how they thought when things went wrong. When asked what the job required, her answer was always the same. You don't need to look the part. You need to show up when it matters. The changes weren't just structural, they were cultural. Radios stayed on longer, maps were updated faster, teams listened more than they spoke, and when drills were run, they didn't simulate clear skies. They trained for the mess. Word got around. Rescues became more efficient, delays fewer. And for the first time in years, pilots started telling stories again, not about their rank or their medals, but about the moments they made count. People still remembered Hannah's flights, but more than that, they saw what she built afterward. A system not based on image but integrity. A space where the next generation could learn how to fly into storms and come out stronger. She never put her name on the building. There was no statue, no ribbon cutting, but if you walked past the briefing room on any given day, you might see her there, standing at the back, arms crossed, watching the next group prepare. And maybe you'd hear her voice in a quiet moment reminding someone what matters most. You don't fly to impress. You fly because someone's waiting. And that's still enough. 6 months later, the storm came without warning. It hit the southern coast harder than any prediction, winds tearing through villages and rivers swelling over their banks. Most of the newer teams had never seen anything like it. But they were ready. The new training center had done its job. In 48 hours, Hannah's pilots flew over 200 missions rescuing entire towns that had been written off on the maps. They worked in shifts swapping stories over coffee and satellite images scrawled with pencil. None of them waited for clearance. They launched because they knew the signs, and more than that, they trusted themselves. In the middle of it all, one report stood out. A supply drop in the Himalayan foothills had gone wrong. A remote village was cut off by landslides, the air too thin for most to attempt. Hannah volunteered. She didn't take Bluebird. She flew a cargo twin that had been donated by a nonprofit. It didn't matter to her. The controls were different, but the mission was the same. The last transmission came 3 minutes after drop-off. Turbulence at ridge altitude, minor engine stall, attempting return. They searched for days. Eventually, the wreck was found wedged between two cliffs. The cargo was intact. The villagers had survived. She had flown the mission alone. The memorial was quiet. There were no brass bands or speeches that reached too far. Just the people she'd trained. People who understood that her greatest legacy wasn't the storm she flew into, but the ones she prepared others to face. Bluebird was moved to the front lawn of the training center, not in glass, not behind ropes, just there where the wind could touch it. Students came and stood beside it before their first flight. Some touched the hull. Some sat in silence. Some read the words painted by hand near the cockpit door. The mission is more important than the machine. They said it out loud before takeoff, not because they had to, but because it felt right. Her words weren't a motto. They were a reminder. Every time they took to the sky, they carried her with them, in the way they checked the map one more time, in how they scanned the tree lines, in the quiet voice that told them to trust what they saw, not what the model said. She became more than a story. She became standard. Not the old kind built on resumes and regulations, but the kind forged in floodwaters, drawn in pencil, spoken in calm moments before the noise began. And somewhere, maybe when the sky shifts or the wind whistles just right past the hangars, a new pilot might feel her there, watching, approving, reminding them without ever saying a word why they chose to fly.